Our interview this morning is with Wayne Keeton. Wayne was born in San Diego, California in March of 1947. He served in the United States Army from June of 1967 until April of year 2009. Highest rank attained was CW5. He was a Warrant Officer 5, kind of rare breed. This interview is conducted at Burleson, Texas on Thursday, April the 21st, 2016. My name is Dale Dexheimer. I am not related to Mr. Keeton in any way. Also in the room is Milton Gibson, our videographer. This interview is conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress and also Operation Remember, City of Burleson, Texas. And with that little intro, Wayne, you can tell us your story of when you were in Uncle Sam's military, sir.
Okay, well, thanks, Dale. I appreciate it. I guess the best place to start is kind of my background. I grew up in a military family. My father was a career naval officer. He's a flight surgeon. And I was born in San Diego, California when we were stationed there at North Island Naval Air Station. And actually, as it turned out, I went back there as a duty station with my dad and ended up finishing out high school and going to college there. I didn't do so well in college, and in those days, if you didn't do well in college, you lost your military deferment, and I did that and was ultimately drafted into the Army in 1967. I went to basic training in Fort Bliss, Texas, and during the in-processing phase, during the aptitude testing phase, I was identified as a soldier who might be capable of going to OCS and becoming an officer. And as it turned out, I went that route and became a second lieutenant, went to engineer OCS at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and was commissioned in July of 1968. And not too long after that, I was commissioned in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I was a combat engineer by MOS and ended up going to Vietnam from July of 69 to July of 70. My job in Vietnam was a staff officer, and again, as a combat engineer, we had numerous outposts that needed construction activities ongoing, both permanent and temporary. And so I was the project officer for 3 and 4 Corps, which was mostly southern Vietnam, to supervise construction projects. I did that for a year there and was stationed at Long Binh, which is just outside of Saigon. I had opportunity to see the entire country. I did a lot of flying on helicopters, and as a result of flying on helicopters, I kind of fell in love with that machine and the smells, the sounds, and just the overall aura and ambiance of flying in a helicopter. So I applied for flight school, and when I came back from Vietnam, I immediately went to Fort Walters, Texas to start my flight school. I graduated from flight school in 1971 in May and stayed in the Army for about 2 more years, and the Vietnam War was at that point winding down, and the Army was offering early outs to anybody who wanted it. So I chose an early out. I ended up doing just about 5 years worth of active duty. And I took myself back to California at this point and back to San Diego and joined the California National Guard, primarily to earn money while I went back to college and finished up my college education. I might say much more motivated at this point than I was the first time I went there. So I did that and ended up finding out that I was in an aviation unit up in Long Beach, and almost to a person, every other pilot in the unit was exactly like me, an ex-Vietnam guy that's come back and joined the National Guard to make some money to go back to college. So I did that for about 3 years with California National Guard, finished my college education at San Diego State University, got my bachelor's degree in marketing, and decided that I would go out and set the world on fire at this point, and accepted a job position in actually in Kentucky after I finished up a course there. By this time I was a captain in the National Guard, And to get promoted to major, I had to go to the another school there. I did it in Fort Knox, Kentucky, the home of Armor, and then stayed in Kentucky for a job, which lasted about 2 years. And I unfortunately had to unjoin the California National Guard, and for about a 2-year period I joined the Tennessee National Guard. And same deal, I was in a helicopter unit there and flew with the Tennessee Guard. That lasted for about 2 years, and finally I decided to move to Texas for a job opportunity, and basically decided to come to Texas for about 3 or 4 years, and ended up, I've been here for 30-some years now. So Texas is my home now, and when I came here at first, I came in as a captain, and in order to get a flying slot as a major, which I was promotable to, I had to take a ground assignment. So I did that, and I became the executive officer for an infantry battalion in East Texas. And after about a year of doing that, found that that was not my favorite thing to do. And so I explored opportunities, and I was told that the only way that I could get into a flying slot was to revert to a warrant officer, which at the time I thought, well, gee, I put in all this effort to become a commissioned officer and everything, but I really want to just fly. And so I was transferred from, gave up my commission and became a warrant officer in 1981. And it was the best decision I ever made. I love the rank of warrant officer. It's one in which you're a technical expert in your field, and over time you become more and more skilled and experienced in that field. And unlike a commissioned officer where you do multiple jobs and become a generalist, as a warrant officer you become a specialist. And so my specialty was flying helicopters and managing helicopters, and so that's what I did, and I enjoyed it very much. I attained, started off with the rank of W2, Chief Warrant Officer 2, and gradually went up the rank structure. I was a instructor pilot for a number of years in the Hueys, and then our unit got Blackhawks, which was very exciting. We did that in like 91, 92, and flew the Blackhawk for a while, transferred from what we called standards, which was an instructor pilot, to a track called tactical operations. I really enjoyed that because tactical operations was a job where I was involved in the tactical employment of Army aviation in all kinds of tactical environments, including jungle or desert or wherever. So I kept that job for a number of years, and in the National Guard, a little bit different than the active Army, although it was ironic that in the National Guard we ended up flying more hours than the active Army did. And I'm not sure why that happened, but we would always get 150, 200 hours a year, where active duty was struggling to get 100 hours apiece, except for some of the more specialized units. So it was really an enjoyable time, and a lot of people didn't really understand this, but in the National Guard, in aviation, the requirements for your training and for your minimums each year were exactly the same as active duty. So how did we accomplish this on 1 weekend a month? Well, we didn't do 1 weekend a month. In aviation, we had what was called additional flight training periods, AFTPs. And it started off, we did 24 a year, so obviously about 2 a month. As the op tempo spooled up around the year 2000, we started doing 48 AFTPs a year. So that was basically once a week you were out flying. And the purpose of that was to keep your proficiency up. It was felt that you couldn't just come and fly once a month and have the proficiency that was required. Also, there was some political debate and policy changes in terms of how to use the National Guard. As the active duty was actually cutting back people, it was felt like the National Guard would be in a position to receive new equipment, new training, more funding, and be basically on a par with the active duty, so that National Guard units could be rotated in to everyday combat situations and be able to function and operate essentially the same as an active duty unit. And that sounded real good at first because we got all this extra money, we got all this extra training, we got brand new helicopters. We actually went up to the Sikorsky plant in Connecticut and picked our helicopters right up at the factory, flew them back here, and we were all excited about that. The downside of all this was, at the time, we didn't think about it, was that you're going to get activated and mobilized and sent around the world to combat situations, which is exactly what happened after 9/11. We started off by being activated to do security at the airports. As you all know, that flying basically stopped right after 9/11. And one of the things that we did, which we were very, very happy to do and very proud to do, is that my commander came to me and said, I want to show the city of Dallas and metropolitan area that somebody can still fly here. And Mr. Keeton, I want you to lead a flight of Blackhawks, and I want you to fly all around the city, and I want you to fly low, and I want you to demonstrate that the Texas National Guard is out there flying. The military were the only aircraft allowed to fly for about a month after 9/11, as you all recall. And so that was a real proud day to go out there and be able to do that. We got a lot of calls from people and thanking us for being out there to do that. So that was an enjoyable time. So the next thing that happened is that we got the Army was had been in Bosnia for several years and had established what they call a stabilization force there. The active Army units then were kind of transitioning out of Bosnia and going to more active conflicts like Afghanistan and then soon to be Iraq. And so the National Guard started filling in for the combat forces there in Bosnia. And I say it still was a combat zone, although we still, flew every mission like it was a combat mission. However, there was not a lot of combat activity that went on. A little bit here and there, but not very much at all. So the bottom line was it was really a pleasure to fly in that country. It's a beautiful country, mountains and rivers and trees everywhere, kind of the opposite of Texas. And so it was really fun to do that. And we got a lot of good training and enjoyed doing that. But Bosnia was we trained up and went up actually joined up with the Minnesota National Guard and went over there for about a 9-month deployment to Bosnia. We got back from that and had about a year and a half to continue our training, and then we got the notice that we were going to be mobilized as a brigade, combat aviation brigade, to go to Iraq in '06. We mobilized at Fort Hood, Texas in January of '06, and were there for 6 months and training up. And if you're not familiar with an aviation brigade, it's a huge organization. We had 5 battalions. We had 2 battalions of Blackhawks, 1 battalion of Apaches, 1 battalion of Chinooks, and then a support battalion that helped maintain all the aircraft. All in all, about 3,500 soldiers, commanded by a full colonel, and we deployed to Iraq starting in July and August of 2006. At that time, the war in Iraq was pretty docile. We'd had the invasion in '03, '04, and pretty much everything was quiet, although some of the splinter groups were starting to cause problems at this time, Al-Qaeda groups, and then the multiple sects of the Muslim organizations over there were fighting each other as well, so there was a lot of internal strife. But the strategy for the U.S. forces was to basically train up the Iraqi forces and stay in your particular bases and not venture out too much. My specific job over there was I was our brigade tactical operations officer, so I helped develop the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we would use to fly in the country. So one of our primary missions was to move people by air all around the country. And as it turned out, we ended up having 2 of our battalions do nothing but fly people around, and it was a non-scheduled but arrangement, but we accommodated the people who needed to move around based on where they needed to go and when they needed to go. So it was a very complex system of accepting what we called AMRs, air mission requests, for people who wanted to move around, and then consolidating all those AMRs and then allocating that out to about 40 aircraft to fly all these people all around the country, and it really worked out great. The whole objective was to keep people off the roads. The roads were really owned by the bad guys, and they would put out IEDs, and as soon as you drive by it, they detonate it and try to conduct their operations on the ground. Could we stop just a second, please? Sure. Talking too much. Now that's better. Okay, I'm ready. And as a result of us being able to move all these people around, it really saved a lot of lives and saved a lot of limbs being blown off, because we could really get people off the ground and get them in the air and move them between places that they needed to go. And there was a lot of people that needed to go to a lot of different places. Our Apache Battalion was the unit that was assigned to assist basically all the other ground units, and they did it with their attack helicopters, so they supported the ground commander and could work with the ground and support them in their combat operations. One of the more significant events that occurred with our Apache Battalion, our unit was what they call a core asset. It belonged really to the bosses of the whole theater, and the Marines had the area to the west of Baghdad called Anbar Province, and the Marines were very actively involved in Fallujah and Ramadi, and especially Ramadi while we were there. And they had a lot of ground combat operations. An issue arose, though, in their aircraft and their air support was restricted by a threat zone matrix that their people had put together that required them to get multiple levels of permission to go into certain areas and fire. And these certain areas were exactly the areas that the ground operations were taking place in. So the Marines requested our Apaches to come out, and we sent 2 Apaches out one evening to support the Marines. And the difference with us is that we didn't have the restrictions to go in these threat zones that the Marines did. They had a little different philosophical approach to it, which I'm not taking anything away from the Marines, because they were hard fighting, and I'll guarantee you every Marine aviator that I talked to wanted to get in the fight. Policies and procedures prevented it to a great extent. So the Apaches came in, and in one operation, well, the big difference was that all we had to do was have the ground commander give us a positive identification on a target, and we could fire on it. And that's what we did. So it was instantaneous support, whereas the Marines had to go back to their base, to their home station, and request multiple levels of permission to be able to fire into these areas. So the Marines figured this out pretty quick, and so they requested Apaches for the rest of the time there. So our Apaches, probably half of our battalion, if not maybe 3/4, were dedicated to supporting the Marines in Anbar Province, and especially in Ramadi. As a result of this, and this doesn't happen very often because there's a lot of animosity and competition between Marines and Army, but the Marines made our Apache Battalion all honorary Marines at the end of the fight there when we went home, which was a huge honor for our Apache Battalion. Our Chinooks are the big twin rotor helicopters, more or less designed to haul cargo and a lot of people at one time. They're so big, and their signature, their heat signature was so hot that they were only allowed to fly at night. This was a security measure based on our interpretation of the battlefield and what our threats were. And they were so big and put out such a big heat signature that they were an easy target during the day, not so easy at night. And also, we had a mission that supported the Special Operations Forces over there. So we had one of our units that we put together was Blackhawks, Apaches, and Chinooks, and we would put special ops people in the back of our helicopters. You could always tell if they were special ops guys because they didn't wear any identification on any of their uniforms or anything. Also, they had different rules. They didn't have any seats in the aircraft. So instead of putting 10 combat soldiers in a Black Hawk, they'd put 20 because there are no seats. They just sit on the floor. And then in the Chinooks, they could haul a lot more than that. So they did all their operations at night. And one of the biggest operations that we were involved in there that's probably topical today and will be in the next few months is we did basically the invasion of Mosul in Iraq, in northern Iraq, their second largest city, and actually captured and imprisoned all the top al-Qaeda operatives in that city and liberated it back in those days, back in 06, 07. About this same time, we got a new commander in Iraq, and most of you all would remember him as General Petraeus. And he was an action guy. He was a very smart guy, and he basically wrote the book on counterinsurgency operations, of which Iraq was deemed to be that. So he petitioned Congress with a plan, and basically that plan was to get off the bases and go out in the streets and in the cities and police the streets and cities, and basically his philosophy was that nobody can get a job or do anything in Iraq unless they feel safe to do it. And you can't feel safe if you can't walk out on the streets, if your kids can't go to school, if you can't go to the corner market without fear of it being blown up. So this is the origin of what they called the Surge. And the Surge was a huge operation, and we were highly involved in it from an aviation standpoint because we were hauling most of the Surgees. But basically, we got out of our bases and went into the cities, especially around Baghdad and the bigger cities, and basically policed the streets. We cut down on the number of attacks and explosions and IEDs from about 120 a day to less than 10 a day during the Surge. So it was very successful, and it allowed the people to kind of get back out. Employment went back up, shops opened back up, and General Petraeus was totally responsible for this. And I know a little bit about this because even though my primary assignment was a tactical operations officer, which was a staff assignment at the brigade staff, I still flew once a week. Because of my experience, I was tasked with flying in our VIP section, so I flew General Petraeus one day a week when during my flying. And so, of course, we could hear in the cockpit what he was saying to the people that were in the back with him. And this is, he was the guy that anybody that came over of any importance, any congressional people, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Vice Presidents, we never got the President over there while we were there, but we hauled around Condoleezza Rice and all the Senator McCain when he was running for president, starting that. And one of the most ironic things I thought was that we had this part of Baghdad called Sadr City, and it was a real hot spot, and almost everybody there didn't like America being there to begin with, and didn't like the government that we had helped put in place in Baghdad. And so it was off limits. We could not fly there at all. And but it was funny, every time General Petraeus had a visitor, he would tell us to fly over Sadr City. And it was a little bit different with us because we always had 2 Black Hawks with him and his entourage, and then right behind us we had 2 Apaches. And so we'd fly right over the middle of Solder City, and I've heard this speech probably multiple times where he'd say, "Now, Senator, I want you to look out there, look in the playground of that school, look at the kids playing out there. 6 months ago, they wouldn't have dared do that. Look at that market right there. There's, you know, people down there shopping and picking up their meals for the night." And so, as you can see, we're making a lot of progress in stabilizing the city of Solder City, and of getting it back to some normalcy. And all the time we're flying there, we're thinking, okay, we're going to get our butts shot today. And we got shot at a lot, but not when the Apaches were behind us. When the Apaches were behind us, everybody knew that if you put your head up one moment, that it would probably be the last thing that you would do. So we didn't get shot at when the Apaches were with us. So we were always glad to have those guys. We didn't talk to the gun guys much because they were all kind of strange people, but we were sure glad to have them with us on some of those days. For the rest of my tour there, that's what I did, was fly him, and most of our missions were picking him up in Camp Victory where he lived and flying him over to the Green Zone where he worked, and then taking him on any missions and picking up any dignitaries that were coming into the airport that he had to usher around and kind of be the host for that person in country. And we got a ton of people that did come over. I think the biggest operation we ever did was when the Vice President Cheney came over, and we had a gaggle of probably 45 aircraft to support his tour, flying him to all the major bases, and so that was an interesting thing. But everybody wanted to come over and fly around Iraq and see what's going on, but then after a pretty short period of time, they were ready to move on back home. It got pretty warm in the summer there. I know this, we had to wear layers and layers and layers of things in the cockpit as we flew. We had our flak vests on, of course, but we also had survival vests, and carried all our ammunition, carried our weapons with us. And by the time you got in the cockpit, you were loaded down with about 50 pounds of stuff. And the Black Hawk is not air conditioned. Well, it is. You just open the windows and let the air come in. But we flew also at low level there. Our tactics were to fly low, because if you flew too high, it made you a sitting duck target for man pads for heat-seeking missiles. So we always flew low, so that the time that we would be in the kill zone would be reduced. And so we flew low and fast, about 150 feet, maybe 200 feet, everywhere we went, and pretty fast. And then if we were in what we considered to be a hostile area, we'd do some maneuvers to make us harder to shoot down. But we got a lot of aircraft shot up. I would say a good part of our fleet had bullet holes in it. I know my aircraft had bullet holes in it on one specific mission, and sometimes you never even saw where they came from. You just come back, and on your post flight, you'd look and you'd see holes in your tail boom and stuff like that. But our unit went to all the hot spots. We were there during the surge, so we were there during probably the hottest part of the war. And as a result, when we came back, our brigade, the Combat Aviation Brigade of the 36th Infantry Division, Texas National Guard, received the Aviation Unit of the Year Award for the things that we did in Iraq. And I'm real proud of that service. We did a great job and got a lot of accolades and saved a lot of lives and kept a lot of people safe and off the roads. So I came back from Iraq in August of 2007, and actually when I went over there, I had to get a waiver because I turned 60 years old in Iraq, and that was the mandatory retirement date. So I had to get a waiver, and I got a waiver for 2 years, but at one particular point in time in Iraq, I was the oldest active flying Army helicopter pilot in the world. And so that was kind of cool. We had two other guys in our unit that were Vietnam veterans as well, and they, one of them was born a week after me, and one of them was born a month after me, so I was the oldest. So, but we were all over there doing our job. And so when I came back, I was asked if I would stay on active duty for a couple more years and help train up other units going over. And so I did that, and finally retired on April 1st. Not sure why they picked that day, but there were no surprises, no Fool's Day. And I retired on April 1st, 2009, and my last mission was on March 27th, so 4 days prior to that, and it was a real fitting mission. It was down at San Antonio, Texas, and at Randolph Air Force Base, and the Air Force has an annual event down there that honors the POWs and MIAs from the Vietnam War. And it's a very elaborate program they put on down there, and they invite all the families of the MIAs and, of course, all the POWs and their families, and they put on a 3-day event there at Randolph, including the event that I participated in, which was a flyover of as many aircraft from that era as possible, and then supplemented by current aircraft. So I got to fly a salute flight to the Vietnam era MIA and POWs on my final flight as a Army aviator, which I was very proud to do. So that kind of sums it up. And Dale, you got any questions?
Great story.
Okay.
I'll go back to the start, but while you're talking about the Randolph, you know Mo Baker?
I've heard the name. I don't know.
Mo was a thud driver, and he goes every year.
Ah.
We had them at Vietnam Veterans Day 3-4 years ago. We had 12 guys who had spent time at the Hanoi Hilton, and Mo was among them. He lives right here in town. Spent five and a half years at the Hilton. And Jerry Singleton was a Jolly Green driver. He spent over 7 years at the Hilton. So since you went down there, they go down.
It's a massive event. I mean, there were hundreds of people there. I mean, they have formal dinners and parades in recognition of them all.
We try to get them to come to our Vietnam celebration here in town, but the Randolph thing takes precedence, certainly. Yeah. Okay, going back. Were you married when you were in the service?
Yes, yeah, I was married. I got married a month before I left to go to Vietnam, and so that was an interesting thing to do that.
Wife ever go with you?
To Vietnam?
Well, I wouldn't think she would to Vietnam.
No. She actually, her father was an Army officer, and so we both were military brats. So moving around every 2 or 3 years was what we did our whole lives. So yeah, as I got back, we went to Fort Walters here, and then down to Fort Rucker to flight school, and then I went out to Fort Ord.
She saw all the colorful spots in the world.
Yeah, the best, only the best. Yeah, we called it L.A., Lower Alabama.
Yes. Let's see here. At one point, 1981, you had Hueys and you went to Blackhawks.
Right.
As a driver, what sort of transition is that? How many hours does it take you to go from one to the other?
Well, there's a prescribed requirement in the Army, and actually in 81 is when I reverted to warrant officer, and then in 91 is when we got our Blackhawks. And so Fort Rucker has a huge desire to control the standardization of all pilots in the Army. So they, rather than having local transitions, they put on schools at what we call the schoolhouse, and you have to go there in order to get transitioned to a different aircraft. So the Black Hawk transition is 6 weeks. You ended up with about 30 hours of aircraft time and probably 10 hours of simulator time during that 6 weeks. But as when you come back, you're fully mission qualified. I'll tell you a story about that. When I went through, I was all excited to fly the Black Hawk. The joke we used to make, though, before I got to go to the Black Hawk transition, we had Hueys and Black Hawks. Well, I was a Huey driver, And so we drive the Huey, and it was you know, a 60s technology aircraft, so it was, you know, just you and that machine. And the controls were very tactile, and there was no automation on it, no computers, and basically it's needle ball and airspeed. And so us Huey pilots took a lot of pride that it required a real pilot to fly a Huey. And of course, we always used to give the Black Hawk guys a hard time and say, well, all you do is push a couple buttons. What's, you know, how hard is that? You're not a pilot. You're, you know, a systems monitor is all you are. So we'd give them a hard time for flying Black Hawks. And then the joke going around was that when they take the last Black Hawk to the boneyard, they'll pick up the crew in a Huey. However, it was a little different than that. So once I got transitioned into the Black Hawk, I found out what an incredible machine it was, and actually it did require a pilot to fly it. But it had a lot of help, and that was good because it has a lot of capabilities. So the requirement, though, is that once you finish the school at Fort Rucker, they sign you off as being a full-fledged Black Hawk rated aviator. But when you come back to your unit, you have to fly your first flight with one of the unit instructor pilots. So I came back and did that, flew it with my good friend named Mark Coburn. But our crew chief was a really good friend of mine. Matter of fact, I had gotten him in the National Guard. His name was Randy Funderburk. I'll never forget him. Great crew chief and wonderful friend. Still is a good friend. So we went out on a night mission and flying goggles, and we came back. And so flight went great, everything went super, ace pilot, all around good guy, and so we parked it and shut it off. One of the things that you do after you get back is you do a post-flight, and part of the post-flight is you walk around and just make sure, you know, everything's where it's supposed to be. And so I was doing my walk around. Well, at the tail of the Black Hawk, it has what's called a stabilator, and a stabilator is about 5 feet 6 inches tall off the ground, and it's a big wing right in the back. And so one of the things that we check as we come around the back is we check the tail wheel to make sure a pin is involved there, is employed, because that holds the tail wheel from swiveling. So I was walking back to check it, and I was looking at the tail wheel while I was walking back with my flashlight like that, and bam! I hit that stabilator right there. You called it, Dale. And it almost knocked me out. I mean, I reeled back, and I looked around real quick, and nobody saw me. So I said, okay, good. And so I finished up the post-flight, and we finished up and went back. So Randy said, well, you want to come over to the house and have a beer afterwards, celebrate your, you know, becoming a Black Hawk pilot? I said, sure. So, and Randy had been a Black Hawk crew chief for a while, so he had seen some of the other pilots fly, and so we had our beer and we're talking and everything, and his wife is there, and so I said, so Randy, I mean, you've seen the other guys, how'd I do? Did I do all right? He said, man, you did great, right up to the point where you walked into the stabilator. So he had seen it, not said a word until the perfect time to bring it up.
Do you still fly?
Yes, I do. In my job now,
Fixed wing or rotary?
both. And it's a little expensive to go out and do it just to do it. I flew with one of my attorney friends the other day. We rented a little 172 out at Spinks, flew down to Brennan Airport, and had a cheeseburger there and came back. So, and we figured out pretty quick that you're not going to, unless you're fairly well off, $250 cheeseburgers are pretty expensive. And that's what the cost of the $500, the cost of the aircraft to fly down there to eat 2 cheeseburgers. So I don't fly too much. In the helicopters, I just finished up a transition course. You asked about transitioning. I wanted to add the Bell 407 to my list of aircraft that I was qualified to fly, so I took the factory course in October, last October, in that. So I still fly as much as I can. I still keep a current medical and FAA medical, and so yeah, I still get out there, just not very often.
Well, good. I don't have anything else. Interesting career.
Well, it was enjoyable, and like I say, the first part was active duty. most of the middle part was National Guard, and then the last several years after 9/11, we were mobilized, so basically back on active duty. And so it was a great way to start and finish my career, and so it worked out great.
We've done a number of these interviews, and I can remember one guy in particular. He's an electrician here in town now, retired, but as a Army National Guard ground pounder,
Right.
he made the tour to the sandbox 6 times.
Wow.
Yeah.
Gosh.
So it's you know, whether you're National Guard or regular Army, a lot to be said.
Well, that Dale is really the price that we all paid when we got all the new equipment and training and money to train. So, but it's good. I think it's good. I remember when I was on active duty, we always looked down our noses at the National Guard, and quite frankly, active duty today does the same thing. But especially in aviation, and I suspect in other areas as well, but especially in aviation, we fly circles around the active Army. And give you an idea, when we were over there, our average pilots are about 3,000 hours and 15 to 20 years experience. And then the active duty pilots are 3 to 5 year experience and 400 to 500 hour pilots. So a huge difference there.
Well, good.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate your service.
You're very
Appreciate
welcome.
you all coming by today.
Thank you.